Okay, hi everybody. Thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. So today I'm going to talk about behavioral economics, a little bit about what it is and how you can use it to build and boost recurring giving programs and kind of harness these insights to raise money for today's most important causes. So I'm Heather Gracie. I'm the behavioral econ specialist with Creative Science. My background is in behavioral econ and social psychology, and I'm super passionate about learning how we can use insights about human behavior and use those to work towards social good. So helping nonprofits and helping improve recurring donation programs is a perfect application of that. So today, this is the agenda. It's pretty packed, so I'm going to move through things pretty quickly, but I think everything was really interesting, so I didn't really want to take anything out. So bear with me, but like Heather said, if you have questions, definitely ask me at the end. I'm going to try to save time for that. So first, I'm going to talk about just the state of recurring giving in general, then give you a little bit of info about behavioral econ as a whole and what that means for the way we think. And then I'm going to go over a bunch of theories from behavioral economics and social science that are super pertinent to building recurring giving programs and sort of fostering a healthy donor base. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and dive in. Giving habits are fundamentally changing. In the past, we've mostly relied on one-time offline donations. That's how people gave money. There were tables set up at supermarkets, or people attended a fundraiser or a gala, or they were recruited by volunteers on the street. You donated to the places that you either happened to run into or the ones that you actively sought out. They gave once, they gave a standard amount of money, and it was very transactional. And once that transaction was complete, donors kind of moved on with their lives. Now, people are continuing to give one time, but recurring donations are increasing, as are online donations. This means several things. First, there are a lot more ways for people to donate and for you to access those people. You can still get to them through setting up a table at a supermarket or fundraisers or galas and things like that. But there's also Facebook and email and Instagram and ads on, Spotify or Hulu, like all of these different streaming services and ways to access people. It also means that donors are starting to expect a dynamic experience. We know enough about donors right now that you can really personalize their experience and foster a relationship with them. And that's something donors really appreciate. And as that becomes more frequent, that's going to start to become an expectation. Assuming this kind of trend will continue, we can expect that in the future there will be a majority of recurring donors, much fewer one-time donors. The ways for people to donate and the places to donate are going to be virtually unlimited. And like I said before, these dynamic, personalized relationships are going to be an expectation. The problem is that if people are constantly accessible, they're going to be accessible by way more organizations too, who are going to be vying for their support. So that's why it's so important to begin building these types of relationships and these types of recurring giving programs now. Because as it becomes more popular, as it becomes an expectation, it's going to be quite easy to fall behind. So this is kind of a staggering statistic, I think, which is that most nonprofits lose 55% of their donors from one year to another, but not all of them do. Charity Water is a super good example. They have a recurring giving program called The Spring, which surpasses $12 million in donations every year. WOTC raised $20,000 in monthly recurring donations in just 2 days. And the common thread here is that they're meeting donors where they are. Not only are they allowing this subscription-based recurring giving service, but they're creating dynamic, personalized relationships between the donors and their organization. They're creating mission moments, where the donors are reminded of the reasons they give, the impacts they've made, and all the good there is left to do. There's a sense of community and an identity as a giver, which is really important. And they're creating this warm glow feeling. When people donate once, they usually feel really good about themselves after. But with a recurring giving program, you suddenly move from having given and that made you feel good to being a giver, so you feel good all the time. And if you can really foster that with people, it can be really, really powerful in gaining continued support for your organization. These are just a few stats about recurring giving in general and how things are changing lately. In general, subscription services, the subscription e-commerce market, grown by over 100% in the past 5 years. And that's not just in charitable giving, it's also subscription meal boxes and clothing and buying a music album versus buying a Spotify subscription. So much is changing and people are really moving towards the subscription-based model. In terms of charitable giving, nonprofits received 40% more revenue from monthly gifts just from 2016 to 2017. So the rate of monthly givers is increasing a lot. And on an individual donor level, the average recurring giver is giving 42% more annually than the average one-time donor. And most importantly, I mentioned that organizations tend to lose 55% of their donors from year to year. For recurring donations, the retention rate is upwards of 85%. This is huge and basically totally mitigates that problem. A common misconception is that recruiting donors, I wouldn't even say misconception, I guess just a different way of framing it is that recruiting donors is getting people to give purely altruistically and not getting anything in return. But there's this theory in economics that's warm glow giving, which is, yes, we want to make an impact, we want to behave altruistically, but part of the reason we do that is because it makes us feel good. So if you think of your donors not as purely givers, but as buyers of that warm glow feeling and of that happiness, that can kind of reframe the way you think about things, and I think open doors to some more creative strategies for helping people feel good while at the same time supporting the cause of your organization. At their core, digital experiences are human experiences. So the idea behind this is we're trying to figure out how do we use technology to create that same warm glow feeling I mentioned earlier that people feel from giving one time offline as a sustained, warm, I am a giver, I am supporting this cause, and this happiness and this satisfaction is now part of my identity. If we can do that, again, it really opens a ton of doors and can be super, super impactful for your organization and your cause. So we do that by bridging the gap and creating a holistic giving experience, bridging the gap between online and offline, and ensuring a symbiotic relationship between donors and the causes they're supporting. So that's a little bit about giving in general right now. I'm going to move into talking about behavioral economics and what that means for the way we think. This is a super general overview, but hopefully it'll give you enough to kind of move forward with a basic understanding and sort of contextualize the rest of the presentation. So if you look at these two tables, you can decide for yourself which one is longer. And they're actually exactly the same. And it just has to do with the way it's drawn and the perspective. We're able to make quick judgments, which is a really awesome feature of the human brain, but the problem is that perception isn't perfect. And when we switch to autopilot, we make mistakes. This means that 95% of our thoughts, emotions, and learnings occur before we are consciously aware of them. It's the reason that when we go grocery shopping hungry, we buy a lot more and a lot unhealthier food than we would if we just eaten before we leave. It's the reason that when we're driving a car, you're not thinking about how hard your foot is pressing on the gas, you're not thinking about staying on the road, watching the other cars, thinking about your next turn all at the same time. That's too much for us to process, and yet it's so automatic. And at this point, we can have conversations, we can listen to music, we don't have to think about any of this. And it's the same reason that when you know that you need your keys every time you leave the house, and yet you can consistently leave them somewhere, totally forget where they are, and scramble to find them before you leave. The reason that this happens is behavioral economics. It is the fusion between standard economics and psychology. So economically, we shouldn't be making any of these mistakes, right? Economics is a model of how humans should behave if we made purely rational decisions based on costs and benefits. But behavioral econ uses psychology and it modifies these models to incorporate social, cognitive, and emotional factors. Basically, it captures how people actually behave rather than how perhaps they should, given like pure rationality. So Daniel Kahneman is a famous behavioral economist, and he wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow that I highly recommend if you're interested in this kind of thing. He splits the brain into two systems, system one and system two. System one is autopilot. I think that's the best way to describe it. It's when you have a simple problem or problem that you've done many times before. We use heuristics, we use shortcuts, and we can solve it really quickly. And we basically relegate all of our easy problems to system 1 so that system 2 can work on more complex things. System 1 is emotional. That's also really key. System 2 is analytical. Problems that are complex or new or somehow different than things we've experienced before, we move into system 2. We take time, we look at the information we have, we analyze it to the extent that we can, and then we try to make an informed decision based on that. If I asked you what the square root of 4 is, you would probably use system 1, and you would say 2, you would answer really quickly, which is great. But if I asked you what the square root of 439 was, that would take a lot more effort, and that would be system 2. Similarly, when you're learning how to drive for the first time, you are thinking about those things. You're thinking about how hard you're pressing on the gas. You're thinking about these other cars. That's system 2. But over time, we integrate it into our system 1 as everything becomes really automatic. So basically, if we relied on our system 2 for everything, we'd never get anything done because we'd just be constantly analyzing and running through every possible possibility. We'd be like a computer, but we can't think as fast as computers, which is why we rely on this emotional heuristic component of our brain, which is system 1. So that's kind of a general theoretical basis for how we think about behavioral economics. Now I'm going to move into specific theories and how those can apply to monthly giving. The first few I'm going to talk about are hyperbolic discounting and loss aversion. Something to keep in mind throughout this presentation is we're always thinking about pains and gains. When we're deciding whether to give, we're basically deciding between there's a pain associated with we don't want to part with our time or our money, but we do want to support a worthy cause. So the decision to give ultimately comes down to which of those two things wins out. And that's a super nice way to conceptualize it when we're figuring out how to most access and affect our donors. So loss aversion is a theory that states that the pain of losing is psychologically about twice as powerful as the pleasure of gaining. So if we lose $10, it falls out of our pocket on the street, it's going to feel twice as bad as if we found $10 on the street, how good that feels. Basically, losses loom way larger than gains, which makes this difficult because if we're deciding between a gain and a loss, and those two things are relatively the same size from a standard economic perspective, from a very literal perspective, we're going to feel the loss a lot harder and we're going to be less likely to want to give. The second part of this, it's a separate theory, but the two kind of work together to again create this problem for us as we're trying to recruit monthly givers, is hyperbolic discounting. So standard economics says that we discount over time. So we would rather get a smaller reward soon than a larger reward later because that time is worth something to us and that can counter the increase in reward. But it gets a little bit more complicated behaviorally. And this is a good example to kind of illustrate that. If you're choosing between a 10-minute massage now and a 15-minute massage later, this was a study that was done, most people tend to choose the 10-minute massage now. But if you're choosing between a 10-minute massage in 6 hours versus a 15-minute massage in 8 hours, people tend to choose the 15-minute massage in 8 hours. This should be the same problem because either way, it's a 2-hour difference. So the question is 5 minutes in additional massage time worth that 2 hours? But our preference is reversed when it's closer to the present versus later in the future. So in general, when a reward is further in the future, we're more okay with waiting. And when a commitment is more in the future, we're more likely to weigh losses and gains more evenly versus in the now, those things are totally blown out of proportion. This is part of the explanation for the intention gap in giving. There's a study that was done, there have been several studies done on this, but one showed that 2 out of 3 people reported donating less than they wanted to. Another one I read was 85% of people donated less than they wanted to. And this totally ties back to those theories, which is really cool. Because when we think about making a future decision to donate and, would I like to be the kind of person that donates, we have no problem committing to it because we're not feeling any loss at the time. We just know that's the right thing to do and we'd like to be that person. We underweight how much that will hurt us and we only think about sort of the moral and the implications for our identity. But when it actually comes time to donate, all of the outcomes are magnified because it's happening right now, which means that loss of your money is looming twice as large as the warm glow of gaining, and people end up bailing. Fortunately, though, a great way to get around that is with monthly giving. And there are three kind of key behavioral reasons for that. The first is that when you're committing for the future, you're not going to lose any money immediately, so we don't feel the loss, right? It's, oh, I'm going to lose something, $10 or whatever, a month from now. Nothing's happening right now. That's a much easier commitment to make to, I'm literally handing you over my $10. We're also explicitly committing a smaller amount of money, which makes us feel a little bit better. $10 a month doesn't sound like much at all, but if I said, hey, can you give me $120 now and then not do anything the rest of the year, I'm much more likely to commit to that $10 a month than to just give you $120, right? And finally, we only feel the loss once. We feel the loss when we sign up, but after that, it just comes out of our bank account, which kind of disguises the pain of paying a little bit because of how automatic it is. And it's why, you know, we feel better buying subscriptions to Netflix and Spotify and kind of things like that. So that is an overview of hyperbolic discounting and loss aversion. I'm now going to move into the identifiable victim effect, which is a different theory that takes on kind of a different angle. This basically says we are much more responsive to the strife of an individual than to a group of people. So a lot of times our strategies to try to get people to donate is to illustrate how large the problem is, but it really doesn't matter how dramatic a statistic is. We're just bad at processing numbers, but we're good at processing stories. So if I told you 1 in 30 American children are homeless, or 2.5 million American children are homeless, that's really sad and it's really staggering, but it doesn't drive me to action so much. Versus if I told you a story of one homeless child that really breaks your heart and you can identify with them or empathize with them or sympathize with them, it makes you feel something, that's going to motivate me to donate. Stories are by nature emotionally driven, and we are too. So it makes sense that we would be much more receptive to story-based donor acquisition. Another kind of interesting manifestation of the identifiable victim effect is that the eyes, if you're including a photo, the eyes are one of the most important ways to visually take advantage of this effect. If you just look at this picture, you don't really know what's going on, and I don't think I would be super motivated to donate because I can't see any emotion in it. But even if you take out the entire rest of the picture and you just see the eyes, I don't know the context, but somehow that's more emotionally captivating to me. So if you're including photos, that's just kind of a nice rule of thumb, is make sure you can see the eyes and the faces of your victim or your beneficiary or whatever that may be. This is a really good example of it. This is the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids. This is the photo they used to use. There are multiple people in the picture, which, as we know, not great. We tend to respond better to individuals. They look happy though, and we're super glad they're doing something about the issue, but it doesn't make me feel emotional. It doesn't trigger me to donate at all. Versus this is a really staggering photo. It sparks a visceral emotional reaction, and so much of that is in this little boy's eyes. And they did do tests on these two photos, and this one just performed astronomically better. It seems pretty intuitive, but I think it's something that is easy to overlook when we're really caught up in our mission and not as focused on the importance of the beneficiaries of it. So it can be easy to kind of misguide a campaign that way. That's the same reason that, if possible, obviously this isn't possible for all organizations, but sponsorships can be really effective. This is Feed the Children. They do something like that. You're helping one specific child, and there have been studies that literally explain to people, hey, you can sponsor this one child if you want, but your money would be much more helpful going to our general cause, because then we can allocate it as needed, and people still tend to donate just to help that one child or opt into these sponsorships, which just, you know, we can give people all the rational reasons in the world. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, our emotions drive our decisions. And if you can spark that emotional commitment in people, it can be really, really powerful. So the next thing I'm going to move into is a really massive category, honestly. So there's a lot in here. And I'm going to kind of hop between topics, but all of them I think are super helpful and super relevant kind of in different ways. So framing in general, this is a really nice, easy example. If you went to the store and you saw 80% fat-free ice cream, that sounds awesome. That sounds super healthy. Think about how much fat is not in there. Versus if I went to the store and I saw an ice cream that's telling me like 20% of this is fat, I don't want to buy that because that sounds horrible. I'm thinking about that 1/5 of that ice cream that is literally just fat. And obviously this is super easy to see they're exactly the same, but the way that it's framed and the way it's described draws my attention to either the bad or the good about them. So we can use that in lots of different ways when we're recruiting donors. This is an example of game framing. So 9 in 10 people have access to clean water. We're on a mission to make it 10 out of 10. Super cool, super motivating, but at the end of the day, 9 in 10 people have access. That sounds pretty good to me. Again, I'm not receptive to numbers. I'm not thinking about that one person because it's telling me about the 9 that have access to water, right? Versus 1 in 10 people lack access to clean water. We're on a mission to change that. Draws me attention. I'm thinking about that one person. I'm thinking about the fact that they don't have water. So again, it's the exact same message, but if we draw attention to the bad thing that we need to change versus rather than the good thing we're trying to make happen, it can be, once again, more emotionally motivating for people, which is another kind of great rule of thumb to keep in mind. A different manifestation of framing has to do with similarity, and it's that people tend to help people who they perceive to be similar to themselves. So this is a really interesting study that they did to test that. In one condition, they were recruiting donors over the phone, and in one condition, they were told that there was another donor who gave $300. Which was helpful because, people learned other people are donating, and that was pretty motivating in itself. But they found that when they matched the gender of the caller with the hypothetical previous donor, there was a 34% increase in donations. Another way to make this happen virtually on a virtual landing page, because I know that, sometimes you're not calling to recruit donors anymore. It's a lot more landing page internet localized. So this is your donor over to the right, this woman, and matching the hero image on your landing page of this little girl to the gender of the donor can help increase donations. So if there was a male donor and you have that data, you can change the photo to be the photo of a little boy. Basically, the mechanism behind that is that similarity increases empathy and empathy increases willingness to give. So to the extent that you can help people empathize with the people that they're going to be helping, they're going to be more emotionally motivated. Switching gears a little bit to another aspect of framing. This is called pseudo-set framing. If I showed you this picture of 5 beers and I said, do you want to buy another one? You'd probably say no, unless you really had a use for it or you're throwing a party with like 6 people. But if I showed you this picture of this 6 beer carrying case and I asked if you wanted to buy another one, you might say yes. Economically, this doesn't make sense. We should want the same amount of beer regardless of the container we're holding it in. But we don't. We really have this desire for completeness and fullness. And if that doesn't happen, then we get kind of uncomfortable. So you can actually take advantage of this when you're recruiting donors too. This was a super cool study that was done where they were trying to recruit donors to send Red Cross boxes to people. This first condition is just cash. So they were shown like, hey, if you donate this amount of money, it corresponds to this item, which is great. And that's a good trick in itself, and that can help. Then there was another condition where you couldn't actually select the number or the amount that you were sending. You just picked the items you wanted. And that helped too, because you basically just sent full items, which was nice. And then there was a pseudo-set condition where it was the same kind of thing where you select the items you wanted to send, but there was also this little graphic on the side that showed you how much of the survival kit that you've completed. So this is a graph that shows the results of that. You can see that the gift did a little bit better than cash. oh, sorry, let me give you context for this graph. The x-axis, it's a bit odd, but the x-axis is just the number of unique items donated, and the y-axis is the percentage of participants who donated that many items. So the gift condition performed a little bit better than just cash. They did tend to donate a few more unique items, but the pseudo-set condition did way better. If you look at all the way to the right, over 20% of people donated all 6 items, which is pretty huge. It's a lot of items, it's a lot of money, but that need for completeness and that literally just a little graphic on the side that told them, hey, you know, this much is still missing, was enough to motivate people to give significantly more money. Super cool. The next thing I'm going to move into is anchoring, which is it's different, it's distinct from framing, but the two kind of work together. This is a good example study. So people were asked, what's the population of Milwaukee? And they were given a reference point of the population of another city. They were either given the population of New York City, which is 8 million people, and said, okay, now how many do you think are in Milwaukee? And people guessed 2 million, because significantly smaller than New York City, 2 million seemed reasonable. Or they were given the population of Green Bay, which is 100,000 people, and they were asked, how many people do you think live in Milwaukee? And people answered 300,000, significantly bigger than Green Bay, right? So seems to be intuitive. The actual answer is somewhere in the middle, it's 595,000, but this is just a crazy illustration of how dramatic one technically irrelevant first number to be given, reference point that you're given, can really, really significantly impact your numbers to the point of thinking there's a 1.7 million person difference in the population of Milwaukee. This is just kind of an actual definition, which basically just says that the initial to exposure to a number serves as a reference point and influence subsequent judgments about value. So even if it's a totally arbitrary, irrelevant number that I was given, if I was then asked to assess the value of an item or how much I want to donate, for example, that number is going to impact me really subconsciously, whether I like it or not. This is the reason that these arrays can influence people, and it's really, really important to consider what numbers you're putting if this is the structure of your donation page, because they're going to anchor people and people are going to latch on to them. So here, another example, super common. Also important, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, that you see a lot of these have a default number. One is already highlighted. Right here, $75. This one doesn't have one. And this one is the $200 Inspire level. That can also be really powerful because of something called the status quo bias or the default bias. Basically just says people are way more likely to select a default option if there is one. We prefer the current state of affairs. So if we're defaulted into something, we feel that is the way things currently are. It's way easier for me to do nothing than to do something. So I'm just gonna go with it. So great example in DC, where we live, where I live, you are defaulted into voter registration when you get your driver's license. It gets way more people to register when you need to opt out rather than opting in. So this is super effective with donations too, because if you default people into something, way more people are likely to go with that default number. But for that reason, you have to be really careful where you set that default, because if, say you're talking to someone, you have a donor on your page and they gave $30 last year, asking them to give $30 monthly going forward would be absurd. They never agree to that. That's so much more money than they spent the previous year. But if someone gave $1,000 last year, then asking them to give $30 monthly would be no problem. It might even be too low. So there's been some research that's done to show that this type of style is the best way to create landing pages and to give a default through this suggested number here. But you can make it dynamic depending on who the donor is, especially if you have data about them. So if you collect that data, you can default one person to $35 a month, a different person to $65 a month, and another to $105 a month. Optimizing this anchor can help compel people to donate, because if they look at that number and say that seems reasonable, they're just going to hit the donate button. They're not going to think too much about it. They're going to revert to that system one, right? It's automatic. This is the easy thing to do, so I'm going to go for it. But if you set that anchor too high and it feels unreasonable, they're going to get intimidated and they're going to forfeit donating altogether because they feel that you're asking too much of them. But if you set it too low, then you're totally just leaving money on the table, and there's no reason to do that either. So great way to do it. If you collect that previous donation data from people, just ask them to give 10-ish% monthly of what they gave the previous year. You do that, it seems super reasonable to them. You're still making a little bit more per year, and most important thing, you're gonna retain them, because once people opt into this program, they don't opt out, which is another manifestation of default and status quo bias. We are moving along. I have 2 more sort of theoretical sections, and then we'll open up to Q&A, so bear with me, we are getting close. The next one is herd effect and social norm theory. Basically just says, it's pretty intuitive, we tend to follow the behavior of a larger group. This has been around since we formed tribes back in the day. Evolutionarily speaking, you know, we followed the crowd back then because if we didn't, we could get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger or something. Today, obviously the stakes are much lower, but if we stand out too much or we don't follow the crowd or we don't fit in, then a lot of times we're ostracized socially and things like that. There's still consequences and they've evolved and the stakes have changed, but it still makes a lot of sense that this is our instinct. So we watch others, we see how they behave, and we use that to inform our own decisions. This is going back to that study of seeing how other people giving impacts us. When you change, you don't match the gender this time even, you don't even have to do that, but obviously that would make it more powerful. But if you said, another donor gave this amount of money before, how much would you like to give today? People are going to give more money the higher that number. And they're also going to give more frequently if you tell people that other people have given before them, which is really important. You can see just as the control, or as the contribution amount increased, so did people's donations. This, you may notice, is also anchoring. It's also social norms. All of these things work together, and the effects aren't mutually exclusive. But the social component of this is, other people gave this much, I should too. That's the socially acceptable thing to do. That's what will make my peers accept me and help me be part of this accepted in group. But same thing, just like in the anchoring condition that I talked about, going too high or too low can be detrimental. So it's really important to strategize, and that time that you take to optimize those amounts, yes, it's an investment, but it will definitely be worth it in the long run. This was an interesting study as well into social norms, and basically they looked into how different makeups of a donation money box change the amount that people put in. And the idea is that people are inferring based on what's in this box what previous donors do. This isn't on here, but empty box, no one donated. They were like, no one else has donated this, why would I? There's no reason for them to. They also found that when the amounts were clearly smaller, like coins and such, you got more people donating lower amounts. When it was higher bills, you had less people donating larger amounts. Pretty intuitive. It's all about optimizing that number, kind of same thing we talked about before. Really interestingly though, the types of donations kind of mattered more than how much was in there. So if you look at these two pictures on the side, there's double as much money in the one to the far right as the one next to it, but the average donation amount was exactly the same in both conditions. It doesn't change so much. It's just people are using, once you move from empty to something, you're fine. As long as they know that some people have donated, all good. But they're gonna base the amount they donate off of what they see previous people do. So you see that off to the side too, larger bills, higher donations on average, but less people donating. So at the end of the day, again, requires a lot of thought and requires a lot of investment in learning what your donors care about and how much is reasonable for them and what kind of lives they're leading and what they're capable of giving you. But if you invest that time in, it can do wonders for your organization. So I would say definitely worth investing in. There are lots of different ways to leverage social norms besides these two we mentioned in the study. You can put social feeds on the side. These people are all giving, I should too. You can show pictures of your other donors and say, oh, you could be a part of this group. And you can create a sense of community, which helps a lot too. It's kind of like I mentioned at the very beginning, this idea of being a community of givers and being a giver, that's a part of your identity, and you're surrounded by other similar people, that's really, really emotionally, that's a draw for people. That makes people feel good. They want to be a part of that in-group, and so that's going to be it's going to be compelling to join, even independent of the good they're doing for the cause. The very last topic I'm going to talk about before I open things up for questions is reciprocity. It's pretty well known and it's pretty intuitive, but if you can intentionally create a reciprocity loop for your donors and your organization, it can be super powerful. So in sum, reciprocity effect just says that we respond to one positive action with another positive action. When someone does a kindness to us, we feel the need to be kind in return. So ways to do that in the nonprofit space are just thank you notes and updates and say, this is the good that your donation did. Thank you so much. Giving people phone calls, just shows of appreciation that show that them as an individual are valuable and they're having an impact. That makes them feel, oh, they took the time to call me. They took the time to send me that thank you note to tell me what I did. I really appreciate that because I know they're busy, so I'm going to continue giving. This is an example. There was a thank you video on the side, also super effective because you're hearing people talk. One just kind of last point that I would say here that's interesting. There was research done being like, okay, well, if it makes people feel good, then we should give them bigger rewards. That's not true in the nonprofit space because they're donating. They know they're donating. You're not conning them into donating. They don't want to receive something in return. They want to give money to do good. The thing they're buying, quote unquote, is that happiness, that warm glow feeling and betterness for the world. So small things are super effective. Thank you notes, thank you videos, phone calls, whatever that may be, but too large a gift feels transactional. Like if I donate $20 and then they send me a duffel bag, I felt like I just bought a duffel bag for $10, and that totally takes away the warm glow component of giving. So make sure to take time to express appreciation for your donors, make them feel valued, make them feel appreciated, make them feel thanked, but don't go overboard and make them feel like they're not even doing any good anymore, right? And once you create this reciprocity loop, which is a great way to think about it, they give, then you give back to them by saying thank you, and they feel compelled to give again because you just thanked them, and it goes on and on. So one last thing to think about before I open this up for questions is that humans make 35,000 plus decisions per day. Every single one of these decisions is influenced by these social, emotional, cognitive factors, the way our brain works. We're not being totally rational all the time. We're not only considering math and numbers. We're considering how we feel, how other people feel, what other people are doing, all of these different things that we've just talked about today. But the great thing is that if we have this understanding of human behavior and of psychology, we can leverage that to help people make the right ones and the ones that are best for themselves and the best for the world. And ultimately, that's why I like behavioral econ and social psych, because I think it helps people do what's best for themselves and do what's best for everybody else. And that's a really beautiful thing. So thank you guys so much for sticking around. I really appreciate you listening. We have a few minutes, it looks like, to open things up for question and answer. This deck will go out afterwards, and my email is at the end of it. So if you have any other questions or follow-ups, or just want to chat with me specifically, you can totally find me there. But for now, if anyone has any questions, feel free to submit those.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Heather. Everyone, this is Heather from Nonprofit Tech for Good. And that was Heather Gracie from Creative Science. We're going to go into Q&A at the moment. First of all, Heather, I want to say congratulations. I could hear your passion come through in your presentation. And also, it's been a long time since I had a lot of wow moments during a webinar. So your knowledge as well. You're onto something really good, and I commend you for that. Sure. So a couple of things. I'm just curious, just to start, how many nonprofits do you think even consider this when they're setting up a monthly giving program or a donate page? Is this something like the way the human brain works is something that fundraisers are talking about and thinking about in general, or not quite yet?
I would say not quite yet. I think we're moving in that direction, and that's something we've seen just in the last few years of more and more people are starting to realize how powerful this can be. But I think it's hard because I think, as you know, everyone here knows, like at nonprofits, things are busy, things are crazy, and you're dedicating resources to so many things that it's hard to think about these kinds of things, and I totally get that. So I think we're moving in that direction, but I would say we're definitely not there yet, and I think there's a lot to be done.
Mhm.
But that's why I like it so much, though, is that uh, the whole kind of rationale behind behavioral econ is it's super small changes. It's just the way you say something or the picture you put up that can make this huge difference. So it's great for nonprofits, especially because you don't need to dedicate a ton of resources to have huge impact. So you can still dedicate all your time to all of the other amazing and very important things that you need to dedicate your time to.
That's right. Okay, we got a number of questions coming in, so I'm just going to jump right in. We have Angela, who has asked about, assuming that there is a possible upcoming recession, we got a 2020 election year, which a lot of people are going to be donating to politicians, perhaps in place of nonprofits. How do you suggest that we kind of lessen the pain in a year that might be tumultuous politically and economically? So just kind of maybe overall, just considering that, but communicating that it's not so painful to give. Anything you've learned there?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question, and also super relevant, especially in this case, because that's totally what behavioral econ is about, is like all of these external social environmental factors, they're going to impact how we feel and impact our decisions. So I think that's awesomely relevant. Um, I would say, harkening back to kind of what we talked about a bit during this presentation, is really focusing on that, on nurturing that warm glow for people, giving them those little thank yous, and also just illustrating the need through these emotional stories, through this identifiable victim, identifiable beneficiary effect. Because at the end of the day, like, the causes that you're supporting are awesome, and there's a reason that you're supporting them and you care so much about them. And if you can communicate that to people effectively using more emotionally driven things, I think, to me, that's kind of the best way and the best bet, because if you drive people emotionally, then you can drive them to feel good, versus if you drive them from like a fact-based, if you drive them with a fact-based argument, then they have no emotional context with which to move further, right? They're basically operating from a clean emotional slate, and they're just like, oh, well, I just gave away $20. Versus if you tell the story of the good they're doing, that kind of gives them a baseline level of happiness that they can move forward with. And I think, especially when you consider like donating to politicians and donating to the political landscape, there's a lot less potential for that there, because it's a much more indirect contribution to happiness. Whereas if you can make it very clear that your cause can create this happiness in this very specific way, I think that could be promising. So
Yeah. And, I will say that I've noticed I've been on social media now for, gosh, over 10 years. And I've noticed during political years, when you do a lot of negative stuff, like, oh, this is so sad, or sad pictures, it doesn't get retweeted. It doesn't get shared as often. I think people get so inundated with bad news that they like good news. So in response to Angela's question, I think what you said is absolutely true, in that just give them a warm glow, give them positive stories to get through all the clutter of chaos that we might have next year.
exactly, totally.
Here's another related question, and really curious where your brain goes on this. There is a report called the Fundraising Effectiveness Project, and every quarter they release kind of updated data here in the United States on giving. And the number of people giving is just dropping every quarter. So small donors, volume donors is decreasing and decreasing. And you would think that at a time when we have record low unemployment and a booming economy, it would be the opposite. So why do you think people, and I don't mean in terms of number amounts, but the volume of people are not giving right now or giving less?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. And I will be honest, I don't have any research to back this up. So this is totally just me speculating. But I do wonder if part of it is in times where people have more money that they're able to spend, they're less conscious about where they're spending it and much more willing to spend it on like luxury goods and non-necessities and stuff like that. So I wonder if part of it has to do with kind of you're thinking less about the value of your money because you have more of it and you're not as stressed about it. And so you're not thinking about the most productive or the most important place to send it. You're thinking about, ooh, I have this extra money. I'm going to spend it on a fancy bottle of wine or something like that. So I wonder if that could be part of it. I also think there is an empathetic component of it where like if I'm doing well, then the rest of the world must be doing well too. And there's like a lack of empathy between someone who feels super comfortable financially and someone else who is suffering because they're not feeling any suffering. So it's hard to put yourself in their shoes. So those are my two kind of pet theories on that. But yeah, super interesting question.
Interesting. It's a good gut instinct, and they're not ones I would have thought of. So Heather, you've got a good mind on your shoulders. Let's see. Victoria's asking behavioral science. You know, I've seen so much information on this, and they have just talked about this and analyzed this to death. But I'm curious of your opinion. What's the best monthly amount in terms of behavioral science? $10, $20, $50? The best amount to ask for when becoming a monthly donor?
Yeah, I think it's real. I don't have an exact number for you. In my opinion, because every donor base is so different by nature of nonprofits, different people want to support different causes, and people that want to support one cause are going to be super different socioeconomically, culturally, background-wise, all of these different factors than another. So, I mean, I would say it's better to go too low than too high initially, and then you can start bumping things up when you're requesting recurring donations, because otherwise you're just not going to, again, people are going to get scared and not donate at all. But to the extent you can collect data about previous donations, like that is the most promising way to do it, because that's how you know your donor base, that's what they're comfortable with. And if you foster those relationships with them, they will tell you, maybe not directly, but at least indirectly with what they've donated previously. And if you can look at what someone donated previously within the year and divide that by 10 or 12 and figure out like about what that equivalent would be in a monthly donation, that's the best case scenario, I guess I would say. Otherwise, we tend to default to, we have a $10 minimum for the platform that we use, and we can sometimes take that off, but usually that does pretty well. But we tend to default to, if there's no data, we tend to default to 30, 35-ish. But I would say I would never move up from that. I would definitely move down from that, if anything.
So $10 or $35 would be the two amounts to test.
I would say somewhere in there, and play around and see what works for you. You can change it every couple weeks and just see how things go. But yeah, testing.
We have another question, and Carline, I believe is how you pronounce your name. She's asking about major donors. So, let's say somebody signs up and gives $100, and they give $100 once a year, and you want to move them up to give, setting aside monthly giving, you want to move them up to give, $500, $1,000 once a year. So convert them into the major donor category. Besides, treating them special email campaigns, special stories, maybe a nice little gift or a super, pretty thank you card or something like that. Have you seen any research on, kind of visual components or keywords in an email or ways to use images on a website that particularly cater to people who have more money?
That's another really interesting question. The thing that comes to my mind first is the community component. If you can create a community and use keywords around that, around being part of that in-group of major donors, that could be super promising. Again, a specific study isn't coming to mind, so this is kind of just a conglomeration in my mind of stuff we do know, but if you can create some kind of like, you can be a part of this if you bump this up a little bit. There's also something called the foot in the door effect, which is kind of relevant to this, which is basically just like, if you convince people to do something small for you, then they're more likely to do something big for you later on. So in terms of just getting people to continue bumping up, if they give like whatever, $500 once annually or something like that, try to get them to convert to monthly at a slightly lower amount perhaps than what that would add up to, and then bump them up over time, and be like, hey, like, do you mind increasing by $15 like next year or something like that? So you can definitely use that to help you. But in terms of images, stuff like that, I don't know anything about that in terms of specifically people with more money. But yeah, I would say community and just kind of easing people in and bumping them up and creating that draw of a giver. This is my identity now, can be good.
Okay, great. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
And then let me see, a simple question here. One nonprofit only has the option of signing up to become a monthly donor at $20 a month. Would you suggest that they maybe add 10 at the expense of losing $20 donors, or maybe they would gain more because they'd have more people sign up, or maybe they would gain more if they put 35? Keep it at 20 only, or diversify?
I think I would say diversify, because I don't think you want to, people tend to be a bit reactive when you're too aggressive about what you want them to do. So if they feel like this is like, I only want your help if you will give me $20 and I don't care about your donation below that, they might take that a bit personally and reactively kind of say no to that. But I would say though, you could keep that $20 default in kind of that open field. So like, rather than having an array of like, here are the amounts you can select, just having a place where they can type in and pre-entering 20 into that would be a good way to kind of keep that $20 focus, but also not exclude people who might feel that was too much pressure, too much of a commitment.
All right. Well, since we started late today, people can be somewhat impatient when technology doesn't work, but I'm glad that we finally got on 12 minutes late. It's interesting, GoToWebinar, I've used them for 10 years, over 700 webinars, and I've had 2 technical glitches, and today was one of them. So Heather and everyone, thank you for your patience. The webinar was recorded. I will send a set of notes probably tomorrow morning with a link to the recording. And then finally, Heather, just how about a minute on what Creative Science does and what your website is?
Yeah, absolutely. So Creative Science is a full-service digital agency. We leverage behavioral economics to impact social good spaces, specifically for health, finance, education, and in the nonprofit space. So we build websites, we do behavioral econ-based consulting. We basically help however we can in terms of sharing this super important, super interesting field with people and helping them figure out how to use that to help them help themselves. Something that's especially relevant to you guys is we also have Cobalt, which is our recurring monthly giving platform. It's basically a plugin. You connect it to your existing websites. It creates your campaign for you. And then we kind of work with you on getting word about that campaign with emails and such. So yeah, those are kind of our major focuses.
I have to ask you one more thing. Sorry.
Yeah,
I saw on your website you're doing some stuff with Alexa. Are you doing any research or beginning to do any research about voice giving and kind of some behavioral science, like maybe volume of voice or sounds that make people want to give? Anything like that starting yet? Does anything like that exist? Behavioral science research around voice giving through voice assistants.
That's so fascinating, and I think people are starting to study it, but I don't know of any sure studies. The two that I would say that I bet would work similarity. I'm sure if I'm a woman and a woman is telling me, hey, you should donate, I bet that's going to help. And two, there's a lot of information about like the pain of paying and how when I like type in my credit card information, that sucks. I feel like really aggressively like I'm losing money.
Yeah.
Versus if I'm just able to say, hey, send $10 to this place, that's going to lessen that pain and kind of balance out that pain gain equation that we were talking about earlier. So definitely more research are being done, I think, in the process, which is super exciting. But
super exciting and fascinating, right?
Oh, it's so cool. Yeah, I'm super excited about it.
All right. Here's to 2020. Lots of good things coming ahead. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Heather. As I said, I'll send you a link to the recording in the notes tomorrow morning. And everybody have a wonderful day. Happy holiday season. And hope you get a good break. It's the last webinar of the year, and come back gung-ho for 2020, a new decade. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.